And now I'll introduce Heather Conway, CEO, Edelman Canada, and in the interest of full disclosure, my boss. As CEO of Edelman Canada, Heather is responsible for overseeing more than 130 staff in the company's 3 regional offices in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. Edelman Canada is one of the country's top PR firms working on strategic communications, mandates for leading Canadian and international brands. Recognized as one of Canada's most accomplished marketing and communications executives, Heather previously served as Executive Vice President of Marketing, Creating Services, Public Affairs, and Affiliate Marketing at Alliance Atlantis. Prior to that, she was Executive Vice President of Corporate and Public Affairs at TD Bank Financial Group. She was the first woman in the bank's history to hold the title of EVP. Please welcome Heather Conway.
Thanks, John. Let me add my thanks to the Canadian Club and to all of you for being here today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to my boss, the President and CEO of Edelman Worldwide, Richard Edelman. Richard joins us today, not long after presenting the findings from the 2010 Trust Barometer at the World Economic Forum in Davos. The Trust Barometer, for those of you who aren't aware, is an international study of trust and credibility that's provided a decade's worth of insights for businesses, governments, and others, and has proven to be an invaluable tool for leaders to better understand themselves, their role, and the worlds in which they operate. While not a pollster by training, I don't think, I can tell you that Richard has an intimate and passionate understanding of numbers, and not just polling numbers. I can tell you as a CEO of his business here in Canada, he has a very, very, very keen interest in profit numbers as well. Trust me, Richard, they're all good, and thank goodness trust in CEOs is up this year. Richard has been named one of the most influential people in public relations in the world. He has counseled CEOs from some of the world's largest companies on some of the biggest issues facing us. His blog, 6 a.m., receives more than 2,000 visitors a day. We are very pleased to have him here with us today in Toronto. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Edelman.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm owning the podium for the next half hour. Bad joke. You'd expect Americans to make that joke. But my subject today actually is an area that Canada surprisingly does own the podium. Do you know that of the G8 countries, trust in business in Canada is the highest among all the G8 countries? Did you know that trust in chief executives of all the G8 countries is highest in Canada? I bet you're surprised. I was. And in a way, it's this silent revolution that I want to talk to you about today. Because the predisposition that you have if you're an American is our socialist neighbors to the north, we free marketers, boisterous, successful, and the reality is quite the contrary, quite the contrary. Quietly, Canada's had a revolution in the last decade, and I'm going to show you the data, and then you can ask me questions about it, but I am here to tell you that, in fact, you do own the podium. What happens on Sunday night is another thing. We'll see. I won't tell you who I'm rooting for purposes of survival, at least until I leave. Okay, so the Edelman Trust Barometer. We've been doing this for a decade. We talk to so-called opinion leaders, 22 countries. We do this every January for Davos. We talk to people in the top 25% of income, college plus educated, people who are so-called media attentive, 3 to 4 media a day, interested in public issues. So it's a fairly select group. It's not a mass audience. Let me just reiterate that. So what have we found over a decade of research? Well, first was the power of NGOs, the power of civil society. We found that, in fact, in Europe, they were the most trusted institution, well ahead of government, well ahead of business. Then, with the problems of Enron, Global Crossing, Garth Drabinsky, I could keep going. We had the fall of celebrity CEOs. But it was easy to say that those were all the concept companies. Those were the sort of new era go-go's. The mainstream of business has it going just fine. Don't worry, we're in charge. The middle part of the decade saw two phenomena. One was the rise of a person like yourself as a credible source. With the advent of everything from Facebook, MySpace, et cetera, you started to see an increasing reliance on friends, family, peers. So instead of the primary method of communicating being top-down, it started to be horizontal, it started to be peer-to-peer. We also saw, in the end of the decade, the real surge in trust in business, well ahead of government in most of the markets that we observed. And so you may remember a cover story in Fortune magazine that had the big fist of business saying, "Business is back." Ah, yes. Weren't those the glory days? Well, a few short months later, September 15th, 2008, I remember it well, because I lived in New York, and you saw people walking out of Lehman Brothers, literally 5 blocks north of our office on Times Square, with boxes, because they were toast. And so were people at AIG, and Citigroup, and General Motors, and RBS, and a lot of others. And trust in business plummeted at an incredible rate. And the consequences are still to be determined. So, what did we find this year? Let me give you some general global observations. Trust in business has come up. It is, however, fragile. The other observation we would make is that trust in business generally is higher than that of government. So it used to be that if business trust went up, government trust went down. You know, vice versa, sort of the seesaw effect. Not the case now. You see coincident moves. But in 18 of the 22 markets, business is more trusted than government. The only markets not: China, Singapore, Abu Dhabi, and I forget the fourth. But it's basically, you know, regimes where you better say you like government. The other point that I want you to remember as I go through this data set is we used to think that corporate reputation was premised on making the numbers and having a charismatic chief executive. That is no longer the case. Today, it is quality products and services, a company I can trust, and a company whose business I understand, transparency. Therefore, if you're in banking doing proprietary trading, which means Amanda and I are doing an off-exchange deal because I'm an oil company and she's a bank and no one has to know what we're doing, doesn't work well. It may work well for her and for me because we both make money. It's not acceptable. Proprietary is a bad word. Something that we understand is a good word. And the last point and most important thing that I want you to take away from today, we have emerged out of this crisis as a stakeholder society, no longer simply a shareholder society. For those of you trained in the canons of Milton Friedman that the sole social responsibility of business is to make profit, that is an outmoded theory. We are now in the time, as Indra Nooy of PepsiCo says, of performance with purpose, both. You have to do both. You have to show that business is adding to social welfare, not just to making its bottom line. It's a very Canadian concept. You start to listen to this, you hear this, and you see why, in a sense, maybe Canada has the right business model. So, as I've told you, trust is up, but trust is fragile. And I want to tell you how trust is up. So, Canada's trust in institutions generally parallels that of other major Western nations. You know, more or less, you have NGOs in the high 50s, business in the mid 50s, government around 48, 49, media at around 38%. So no big news here. Sorry, just have to tell you the truth. You're my friends, but I always have to tell you the truth. What I want to show you, though, is the tracker for Canadian trust in institutions over the years. What you see is, in fact, that NGOs have always been the highest ranked institution in Canada. However, interestingly, for the really first time, business is comparable to NGO trust. Business trust is at its highest point ever in Canada, give or take, comparable to 2005, 2006. So also note, Canada's trust in business did not have the parallel drop that was observed in the United States last year. Last year in the United States, there was a 19-point drop, the biggest we've ever seen in any market anywhere, so that American numbers were comparable to those of so-called old Europe, Germany, France. That's how low it got in the United States. It's recovered somewhat in the States. Then you see that government is quite below, 48, 49%, and media around 40. So basically, what we observe, so I didn't get to show you all those statistics. Now you see the whole picture. Now you see the 5 years. So let's look at Canadian trust in business comparable to the EU and the US. I think it's important to note that compared to UK, France, Germany, trust in business in Canada is well above, because that would be sort of 36, 37. There are markets in Europe, for example, Holland, others, where trust in business is higher. Trust in the States has come back nicely in business. But importantly, what I want to point out to you is, look at Canada over time, trust in business. I'll keep clicking. Here we go, all the slides. We did not observe the problem of the world financial crisis in Canada. Trust in business was not affected by the drop. This is a distinction from the United States. Canada has sailed through this quite unaffected. So here's the Enron, here's the worldwide financial crisis. So, there is a stability of trust in Canadian business that I'm not sure all of you are quite aware of. This is a very modest country, and you're particularly modest about your trust in business in Canada. You should be a little bit more braggadocio. Take it from an American. That's what we do. Trust in government is fairly stable in Canada year on year. You'll note the Obama bump. I wonder if we had done this survey in January as opposed to have done it in October, pre the healthcare imbroglio. I think trust in government is off substantially in the United States in the last few months. I also want to show you that we now find, interestingly, a coincidence of trust levels in NGOs from the major economies around the world, around the mid-50s. What's changed over time is Canada stayed pretty much high in the 50s. The US started very low in trust in NGOs, and over a decade has come to mid-50s. China is very low in the mid part of the decade, has come absolutely straight up. So there's this coincidence around the numbers mid-50s in trust in NGOs. So NGOs are truly the fifth estate in global governance. You've always known that in this country. It's not been the case south of the border or in Asia. It matters hugely now. If you're RIM and you're operating in China, you better pay attention to NGOs. They matter now. Now, the best news of all for the day. That jersey with the maple leaf is hugely helpful to you if you are a global corporation operating outside of home borders and you don't make enough of it. Truthfully, being a Canadian company makes you the most trusted nationality of all around the world, equivalent to Swedish, German. And it's consistent. It's very consistent for Canadian companies. Look at this. All around the world, in almost every market, you're in the high 70s. You have to use this more. Stop selling yourselves as, oh, we're just brand X. Country of origin? Well, we're not really. We're just one of those people we don't talk about. Forget it. You're Canadian. That's a big thing. Put it on your jersey. That's helpful. Hugely helpful. Why? The concept of being a social, democratic, stakeholder society, embracing country is great now. This is no longer the time for the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American model of, kick-ass capitalism. It's time for conscientious capitalism. That's the Canadian brand. Use it. Don't underplay it. Make an advantage of it. I sound like a messiah, but I'm not. So, in fact, let's go through, sorry. This is the chart that I should have had up while I was being messiah. But messiahs don't need charts, right? All right, so also, another secret sauce for Canadians. Your brand is associated with technology. Technology gives you not only the jersey, but the halo. And maybe your guys on Sunday will be wearing halos because maybe that'll help them win. But, bad joke, I'm trying here. The fact is, technology is the #1 trusted sector in Canada and the #1 trusted sector everywhere around the world. Everywhere around the world. Now, the second, third, fourth places vary substantially. But generally, it's tech, it's biotech. In some countries that associate automotive and energy with development, it's quite trusted. Energy, interestingly, for Canada is a tremendous asset. We were talking before about the oil sands. It may not be so loved south of the border, for example. You got a sales job to do on that, as to the cleanliness thereof. Okay. Let's talk about banks, a subject that your country knows quite a bit about. The trust in banks over the last little while in the US, in France, in Germany, and the UK has collapsed. Collapsed. Banks were the third most trusted sector in the United States, 2007, 2008. Today, 9th. Big surprise, I'm sure, all of you. Citigroup, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs. But what I want to show you is where it didn't collapse. In fact, where it went the other way. What is the one country in the world where trust in banks went up? Canada. It tells you something. It tells you about the remit. It tells you about the separation, perhaps, of investment banking and commercial banking. It tells you, perhaps, about the value of having sizable institutions as opposed to the diaspora. I don't know. But what I do know is the facts, which is that trust in Canadian banks has gone the positive way. So I've given you some facts about trust. I now want to establish that trust, even in Canada, in business, is fragile. Now, why do I say that? I want to give you 3 data points. Okay, first, 70% of Canadians believe that as soon as the recession is over, companies are going to go right back to doing what they did before, which may not be such good stuff. So there's big suspicion. Further, most expect that government will continue to influence financial institutions well into the future. Now here, that won't be any great change. Where I come from, that's a big change. But most of all, I want you to see these charts. When we asked which short-term actions would most help restore trust in business, look at these numbers. Just about 70% across the board for Canadians said fire non-performing management, repay bailout, and reduce the gap between CEO pay and employees. Those are highly positive actions. Joke. You got that. Okay, the president, whose numbers are not very good right now. So I told you at the beginning of the speech, and now I'm going to show you, that corporate reputation is now premised on very different factors. 3 years ago, when we asked this question, what builds great corporate reputation in Canada, the answer was, first, quality products and services. Second, an outstanding leader. Third, terrific financial results. Those were numbers 1, 2, 3. Well, look where they wind up now. The first that builds corporate reputation is transparent and honest business practices. The second is a company I can trust. And a third is outstanding products and services. The bottom three, well down, are delivers consistent financial returns, then highly regarded CEO, and then innovative products. What does it tell you? It tells you that we basically believe that those last three are an outcome of the first three. That if you have a company that is transparent, a company that focuses on high quality products, that you will deliver the numbers. It's no longer enough just to have a showman CEO type. You got to actually deliver on those things that matter to people. Tell them how you do, what you do, and you're going to win. If you keep it to yourself, you're going to lose, no matter how good your products are. It's not enough. Now, I want to also show you an important question where the Canadian data vary slightly from the global data, but the hypothesis I gave you was we have moved from a shareholder world to a stakeholder world. And maybe it's partly because we've been burned in our personal portfolios. Maybe it's because, we have realized that in order for business to prosper, it has to prove itself in society. Maybe it's some combination of all of those things. But when we ask the question, if a CEO is making a decision, which stakeholder ought he or she pay most attention to? In Canada, the biggest group by far was all stakeholders. I can't decide. Followed by investors and employees, customers at the end. Across the world, generally we found plus 50% of people saying it was all of the above. I can't distinguish. Doesn't matter to me. All of them matter equally. Now, just a few more data points about this changing nature of trust. Business has lost the ability to operate unilaterally on issues that matter for global future. Example, health, obesity, environment. How do we find this out? 3/4 of people say that they are much more likely to trust a company that partners with an NGO to battle global issues than if the company does it itself. It tells you that civil society is no longer just an option. It is something mandatory for a smart company. Sonia Bowden knows this better than anybody. Now, where are people going for interesting and credible information? This is changing quickly and profoundly, somewhat less quickly in Canada than in other markets, but still changing quickly. The first place they're going for credible information about a company is financial analyst reports, and second is articles in business media. Followed closely by conversations with friends and peers. Remember, I talked to you about the horizontal conversation. Then, other classic forms of mainstream media, Amanda's favorite, television news, articles in newspaper, TV, and radio. But notice that you've got now what I would call a mosaic, because just as credible as articles in business magazines, if you can believe it, are corporate communications such as press releases. I never thought that possible, but for all of you PR people, sharpen up your game. Conversations with company employees, just as important as articles in business magazines. Who do you usually talk to last if you're a CEO? Your employees. What's the silliest thing you can do? Talk last to your employees. Why? Because you wind up with websites like deltasucks.com. My favorite website for never ever wanting to fly on Delta Airlines. Every urinal, every tire that's a little flat, every pissed off stewardess, you get deltasucks.com. Talk to your employees. You're going to still have Delta Sucks, but it'll be a better product. Notice the rise of social media at the bottom, and particularly for the 25s to 34s, the totals are 33% in Canada. Trust-free content sources is media. I can't remember who I was talking to about this last night. Heather, about Wikipedia. Wikipedia content shows up in places you can't believe. It's just assumed to be accurate. It says I have 3 sons. By the way, I have 3 daughters. I correct my own Wikipedia page. You know, seriously, garbage in, garbage out. I mean, it is the vox populi, but it is accepted. You must consider it. Online search engines, again, the game for you, if you're a corporate, is you better go to Google and say, okay, so what are they saying about, ITT Corporation or whatever? And if the first 10 citations are from NGOs blasting your water products or whatever, you got trouble. You better help change the conversation and have better content that you're pointing people to. The game's changing. It's a mosaic. It's not anymore a single broadcast on CTV or anything else. And I want to point out to you the trends in television, radio, newspapers, and even friends and peers. We have a dispersion of authority, folks. We have a real drop in trust in any individual news source. So the drops are much more dramatic in the US and the UK, France, Germany than they are in Canada. But the trends are clear. The trends are clear. Dispersion to social media, dispersion to friends and company employees, away from mainstream media. Actually, Canada is remarkably stable, relatively, in the last couple of years. Now, who's credible? Again, Canada actually is different in this. What I want to point out to you is, more or less, you've got a mosaic in Canada of equality. This is different from the US, where chief executives are at 25% credible, and academics and experts are at 55 to 60. In Canada, what you see is academics at 50, CEOs at 40, financial analysts at 50, NGO reps at 50, so so equality. That's the whole idea of mosaic. So if you're relying on your chief executive, rolling him or her out, and saying that's the company point of view, not good, not good enough. Get experts, get NGOs on side, work your financial community. You've got to have multiple voices. CEO, supporting cast. Think of it that way. So I just want to show you comparatively for Canada relative to others. Eventually this will all come up. Just take a look at how different Canada is from the rest of the world, and also what a spike CEO credibility had in the last year in Canada. Big jump from 19 to 39. We've never seen that kind of one-year jump for any one country with a spokesperson. The Canadian CEOs actually did pretty darn well in this crisis. Bank CEOs in particular, relative to some of their peer group in other countries, not to be named, but they're in the South, you know the country. Okay, so where am I coming to out of all this? I've told you that trust is up, it's fragile. Trust is now a real line of business if you're thinking about corporate reputation, that we're in a stakeholder world. But I want to go further than this. I want to suggest to you that you really need to be thinking about capitalism 4.0. It's the most interesting thing I heard in Davos. The first phase of capitalism really was Adam Smith. And that phase really in the minds of economic thinkers lasted until the Great Depression. And then we had capitalism 2.0 and a heavy foot of government in business for really, I don't know, a good 50 years, give or take, till Thatcher and Reagan was capitalism 3.0. And that period really lasted for more or less the better part of 30 years. Capitalism 4.0 began September 2008, and the book is still being written. But I think it's about business and society. It's performance with purpose. It's conscientious capitalism. It's philanthrocapitalism, however you want to talk about it. But it is not this blind rush to shareholder value where we know everything, you know nothing, we'll just make profits and you guys will be happy to have your paychecks and big stock dividends. I think that the question of capitalism is really still being determined To what extent, again, where I live, will government continue to be an investor, a director, or a referee, or a player? I think that there's a lot to be said for the model that is extant in Canada, where there is, I think, an increasing freedom of business from the government, though within a defined set of rules. And that may be a model that all of us can look to. We are urging all of our clients to look at a different way of considering capitalism 4.0, which is public engagement. And our way of characterizing it is advancing shared interests in a world of interdependence. That we are linked, that it is not business silo from government, silo from NGOs, silo from communities, that in fact we are actually, as business, the best hope for change, but it must be done together. It must not be done unilaterally. And that in fact, if you're able to listen to new voices, if you're able to be smart enough to go where the conversations are happening, not just wait for people to come to mainstream media, to create good, credible content so that when there's a search inquiry on Google about Diane France's new book or whatever it is, you've got to have content that you can go to, that she's written and puts up, and then bloggers can discuss it. It's got to be a shared conversation. It cannot be we talk at you and then you talk to everybody else. And I also would urge on all of you corporates, be open advocates. If you're promoting the oil sands, say, I'm here to promote the oil sands. Here's why it makes economic sense. Here's what we're doing to capture the carbon. You know, it's not the perfect thing, but it's sure a hell of a lot better than relying on the Middle East for oil. And the last thing I'll tell you is develop new influencers. When we look at our healthcare programs, just as powerful as a story in Newsweek today is a passionate post by a woman who writes her own blog about diabetes, Diabetes Mind. She's got 30,000 diabetics who, you know, read her blog actively every week, and she's a thought leader. And you can learn a hell of a lot from her if you're a corporate. You know, influence is dispersed. It's not any longer, you know, the people at the York Club and sitting there, you know, as good as they are, they're probably all in their red leather chairs thinking they still run things. But it's not the case anymore. The world is dispersed, grab it. So with that, I'd love to take any questions. Thank you. Not too long. Questions? No questions. Yes. Yes. Over there.
I was just wondering if that trend occurs when there's been a specific incident where a CEO has had a major public profile. Now, obviously, we didn't have significant bank failures in Canada, so we haven't had that negative, but we did have Michael McCain, who was extremely visible in the press when Maple Leaf Foods had their tainted food story. And I think he was generally very, very well regarded for how he handled it in terms of transparency and whatnot. So I'm just wondering if that particular incident, and it lasted for a number of months, if that would have had an impact on your survey in Canada.
I think all these things are relative as well. So if there had been an outstanding public official who might have taken up some of that space, you know, that would have made it harder for CEOs to get so much increase in trust. But you had no trust incidents that were really terrible, and you had a couple of examples of CEOs actually stepping up and saying, you know, I'm either going to reduce my compensation, or, you know, we're going to take the product off the market because it's not safe, or whatever. So I think that's indicative of responsible chief executives. So yes, the answer is, to your point, yes, was good. There was another, John.
The question you raised about people worrying about things going back to where they were. And I'm wondering what differentiates, say, this year from past years that sort of in your mind indicates that maybe we won't go back down that road?
I'm going to tell you what makes me optimistic and what makes me pessimistic. I'll start with the pessimistic. I think fund managers are still pushing their holdings in a quarterly and even more rapid manner, so that, you know, I want my return, Mr. or Ms. CEO, and I'm not a long-term shareholder. You know, I'm a hedge fund, I'm a whatever. And I think that's a real problem. The capital markets are skewed toward short-term performance. You may disagree or agree, Amanda, but that's what everything I hear from my people who I, you know, am friends with. On the positive side, I think more and more chief executives are saying, so what? They don't want to own my stock? Too bad. You know, I'm not going to give a quarterly estimate of my earnings. I'm not going to burn the furniture to make the quarter. And I'm not going to cut my research budget. So I mean, I heard the head of HSBC, of PepsiCo, of Tata, they all were sort of lining up to say in Davos, it's a new time. Businesses' role in society, but the key point is we're not doing it for philanthropy. We're doing it because green equals green. We're doing it because we have to have a sustainable business model. Okay, so if you think about it, it's always been, well, we'll give some money on the side and keep people quiet. And, you know, now it's the BATA model of, you know, we're building a sustainable enterprise, and we're going to employ people, and they're going to make money, and then they can afford to buy our shoes, and we're going to manufacture locally, and we're going to invest in schools, and they're going to have good water, and so it's a bigger role and a bigger responsibility for business, but, you know, they'll have customers who are able to be around. Other questions? Amanda.
I'm just on a specific point on Toyota. You said that trust and transparency are as important as quality of product. What if you've lost both?
You know, it's a very interesting conundrum for a global company in such a strained environment. So the CEO of Toyota is behaving exactly right for a Japanese audience. He's come up 3 times, he's apologized, he said we're working as hard as we can on it. And I think for a global audience that works once, not 3 times. And so for me, I'm interested in, okay, I get it, you're sorry. You want your products to work, I know that. So what was the problem? How can I be sure it's not going to happen again? Where did we go wrong here? Is it too much electronics in the product? You know, which supplier failed you? Even if they don't know that, I'd like to hone in a little bit more on what the nature of the problem is, because it seems systemic as opposed to specific, right? Delimit the thing if you can. So what you're sort of really getting to is what would you do if you were me for Toyota now? And I think that I would designate their director of engineering, preferably a Western person who's Canadian, American, whatever, who says, I'm touring the factories, I'm telling you no car's going to go out of here until I'm sure it's safe. And I'm in charge. And you know, here are the 5 things I know, because I've already checked them off, and here are the 4 things I don't know. But no car will be sold until it's right. Something really aggressive like that. Instead of these gauzy ads that say, oh, we make cars in Kentucky, and we make cars there. Yeah, so? I don't care where you make them, right? If I'm driving, it can't like go fast and then, you know, I go off the road. Not a good idea. Questions, other? Yes.
So where does the change in trust actually translate to increased sales? Because you look at in the depression that's happened just now, sales of Walmart have increased, and you know most of those have come from third world countries or other countries where most people don't even know who the manufacturer is. So in your survey, where does it actually translate into the type of products that would be influenced by this trust?
So I'm going to give you two answers, not to be evasive, but they're two correlated. The first is survey after survey is indicating that the best talent wants to work for companies that have capitalism 4.0 attitude. And so that's very relevant. Particularly recent B school graduates have indicated this. Did you know that 2/3 of the graduating class at Harvard Business School last summer signed the MBA oath, which committed them not to maximize individual gain, but that they were looking out for their whole company and even more for what's going to be good for society. Go to the MBAoath.org. It's a very interesting read. Second, we do a corollary study called the Good Purpose Study, which I'm happy to send you if you give me your card. Indicates by a better than 2-to-1 margin, people are preferring to buy products that have a social value as well as a functional benefit. So I'm a complete believer in this. I do think there's a price point issue. I think that at some point, and this is according to Walmart, a product has to be priced within 5 to 10% of the other option. You can't be 50% above. But if it's 5 to 10, people will buy the eco brand over the other. I hope that answers in as much as possible. Other questions? One last question. Anybody else? Yes.
This is a little bit off the presentation, but I think in the data as well, but you can tell me otherwise if I'm wrong. You talked about short-termism as a problem in the financial industry.
Yes.
And I think it's also a problem in government as well.
Yes.
So I'm just curious if you could comment a little bit on some of the trends you're seeing in trust in government, and I know they're down, and perhaps what you see as the drivers of that decline.
Well, I come from the country that probably has the biggest issue with this right now. And I think the problem for government is the expectation of rapid change and bold agenda being nibbled to death with 1,000 small cuts, and then all of a sudden, Massachusetts election and other things have prevented it from happening. So I think that the Obama people are, they're bemused by their fall within 1 year from sainted to weakened. And I think the secret in communication here is the lessons maybe are do fewer things better, don't be so present if you're the boss all the time, because you lose your power of convening if you're too front. And then use, again, the lessons of this trust barometer are the multiplicity of sources and the multiplicity of spokespeople. And so, I mean, one of the things that I find the most difficult to understand for Obama is why hasn't he or his deputies spoken more of the business community? Because this is a group that, they didn't necessarily support him. They supported McCain maybe, but they have convening power. They have the ability to, and that just hasn't happened. You have to use this idea of the congregation and informing the congregation. And the campaign did this brilliantly on myBarackObama.com, and I was an early contributor. Of course, my family's from Illinois, and I wrote an early check, and so. But I was constantly getting emails from the campaign. Do you know that the day they went into office, that stopped? Why? You had 10 million people, and particularly guys like me who if you give me material, I will spread it. Example, there's a thing called the Israel Project. I don't know where any of you care about the Israel-Palestine thing, but the Israel Project was set up to provide information to those who are so-called pro-Israel and allow them to then repurpose and send along with their own views. That's very smart. The White House has to get back to some of that dispersed communication. Command and control is not going to work here. It's too dysfunctional in Washington. There's too many sort of sound bites. What's your impression now? It just, your head's spinning. You can't absorb it all. It's simple, but it's also stories from lots of places that touch you individually as much as you can. Okay, that's it.
I'd like to ask Amanda Lang to come to the podium, please, Vice President of the Canadian Club of Toronto.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be asked to thank Richard for this, and in fact, an honor to hear him speak. As you've surmised, and many of you know, Richard has the ear of global leaders, both in business and in government and in NGO, and it's fascinating to get a glimpse inside his thinking on issues. The Edelman Trust Barometer is an important guide, partly because it's long-term, so we get the sense of the history of this thing. And it's obviously revealing. It's interesting to see that old-fashioned values are back in style. It's nice that Canada is back in style, or maybe in style for the first time. It's also, I guess, comforting to know that some things will never change, and that no matter who rises and falls in trust, media will always be at the bottom. Richard, we appreciate you being here today. It's a real pleasure. On behalf of the Canadian Club, our thanks.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you again, Richard, for your speaking. And thank you to all of you for being here today. This concludes our television programming, which will be broadcast on Rogers TV in the days to come. We are grateful to Rogers TV and 680 News for their continuing promotion of Canadian Club events. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon.